Welcome everyone to this expert session, and thank you so much to Shani ma'am for coming and attending this and being the expert for this session. I'll start with a small introduction about Tishani Doshi, and then we'll move on to our questions. If you have any questions, you can start writing, you can start typing them down as and when you think about them. So, a small brief introduction. Tishani Doshi writes poems, fiction, and essays. For 15 years, she has worked as the lead dancer of the Chandralekha Company in Madras, performing across the world. Her debut work is called Countries of the Body, which won the Forward Prize for Best First Collection in 2006. Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods in 2017 headlined the All About Women Festival at the Sydney Opera House and was shortlisted for a Ted Hughes Award. Coming to a novel, The Pleasure Seekers in 2010 and Small Days and Nights in 2019 have been shortlisted for the Hindu Fiction Prize and the Tata Fiction Award and the RSL Ondat Prize. A God at the Door, her most recent collection of poems, was shortlisted for the Forward Poetry Prize in 2021. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and an associate professor of literature and creative writing at the New York University at Abu Dhabi. Thank you so much for giving us your time and making time for to teach all the people here at the First Draft Club. There's so many questions that we have, and I'm sure they have as well, about your work, about your poetry. It always leaves a very vivid image in all of our minds, all of your words and everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, uh, so that was a small bio that we have. That is the front-facing bio that we have. But can you tell us a bit about yourself and what do you do when you're not writing?
I spend a lot of time not writing, actually. I haven't written anything for, I think, more than a month now. Um, it's, life, you get on with various things. I'm at a certain age where I'm also taking care. I'm in a very managerial phase of life, so it's not a lot of fun compared to some years ago when I was seeking and I was traveling and I was doing Kalaripayat lessons and going here and yoga and whatnot. A phase of discovery, and now it's a phase of organizing stuff. However, I think throughout whatever phase of life I have been in, writing has always been this need, the thing that brings the most joy. So I feel like I'm doing other stuff, but then I have to find place for writing. And it's always periods of being very in the mode where I'm writing regularly, and then where I kind of fall off the wagon and then I have to clamber back on. So right now, because I'm teaching and I'm in a full academic mode, also, I am not able to really think of my own work. I think of my students' work. I think of organizing conferences, and that's a different part of the brain. But I don't worry about it so much because I'm not one of those writers who writes every single day, and I have never been. So the times when I'm not writing, I'm thinking about writing, I'm reading, I try to keep the project in my head in some corner, so that if I see something that's inspiring or something that triggers some kind of response, I can just store it away for when I am writing. So that's how it is. I'm like most people, I think. I have to cook, I have to feed myself, I have to clean my house, I have to feed my dogs, I try to do some exercise. I live, and now I'm in the very sort of the working part of my year, which is very intense. So there's a certain rhythm to the days depending on where I am.
Okay, so you've been immersed in the world of artistic expression, starting with dance and
Mm.
literature. So, how did your writing journey begin?
I think very young, when I understood that words had a kind of power. I must have been, I think, my father had these diaries that he would bring back from his office, and I remember writing in them a kind of outpouring of I don't know, I was annoyed by something or somebody, and as a child, it was a sort of repository of my hurt and my pain, and a little bit probably self-pitying, I'm sure. But anyway, it was a way to liaise between whatever was going on inside and the outside. And I think that very early on, writing became this act of mediation between the inner world and the outer world. And I feel that that's not really where I decided to become a writer, but I understood a kind of power then. And then through school, a real appreciation for language, for books, for reading, all of that. But the actual point of considering what it might be to call oneself a writer or to pursue writing in a more serious fashion happened when I was a junior in college, and I was studying, uh, doing a degree in business administration in North Carolina. And it was my third year as an undergraduate, and I just took an intro to creative writing class. And that's it. It just something in my brain readjusted, and I, I think I discovered a certain flexibility or certain fire in language and the contemporary poetry that I was reading at the time that just made me think, I want to do this, but I want to do it with my own context, with my own language, and with my own sort of set of circumstances. And that was it. I had to abandon commerce and accounting and statistics, and I never looked back after that. But there was this click in my brain that actually I love this. So it was not just a question of competence or being able to, but it was just that I couldn't imagine not spending my life pursuing this, even though it seemed such an uphill task in terms of how does one live as a poet? How do you become this? There is no guidebook to it. So you really have to figure it out and take a lot of big decisions, which are quite scary. But I've had very few moments in my life of certainty, and that was one of them. And so at that stage, writing moved into something that was not just a hobby, but it was the lifeblood, it was the thing that was going to be what I do.
Mm. That's so interesting because I didn't know you came from a background of economics and commerce and then came to writing. So that's amazing. So in your book, A God at the Door, you've acknowledged some of the inspiration behind the poems in the notes section,
Mhm.
which is extremely fascinating because that gives us a glimpse into what bothered you. Maybe something struck a nerve. And can you tell our audience here a bit about your approach to poetry writing?
So I don't know that I have one approach. I think it's changing from book to book. I know that my first book, it was very much uh, like the years of becoming a dancer when I first started dancing in my mid 20s. And it was this sense of a very visceral inner journey. And then each book has been different. So, A God at the Door, this is the Indian cover, which I like very much. That one was written during the COVID pandemic, the first few years of that. And I think all the poems, a lot of them were directly inspired or triggered by news items. And it was really interesting to me that usually, for a lot of the times, the triggers for poems arise from some internal issue. But here it was outside. The world outside was changing, and it was such an existential crisis, and we were going through it all at the same time. And there seemed to be something so powerful and potent about the fact of going through it, but also this dread of will we survive and what will happen to us. And I think I found it a very rich ground for poetry. But there were stories. For instance, there was a story of when the migrant workers were walking back to their villages overnight, for days and days. I remember a story in the Hindustan Times about seven men who came back to their village in Bengal, and they were made to stay in a tree because there was no place in the house, and they had to kind of do their quarantine in a tree. And then just stories about this attack on a maternity clinic in Kabul in the middle of all this craziness, this horror, stories about how the Speedos were coming back as a fashion statement. I mean, everything from the very funny to the very serious to the horrific. All these news items were a way for me to intervene and to try to again do this mediation. And they were a way for me to create a response. And so at the end of the book, there's a lot of notes because they come from specific headlines. And I would say that the book that is coming out next year, I have a new book, are very different poems. I've almost I've run from the news because, I mean, Arundhati Roy talked about the pandemic as a portal, and there was this sense of, if we get out through this, will we be able to reset our societies? Will we be able to see the inequalities? Will we be able to attend to these things? And will we have a chance to do something more than we have in the past? And actually, what I've found is that we have fallen into great despair. We are in a state of huge violence in many parts of the world, politically divisive in many parts of the world. And I feel like that kind of hope that, we were talking about, hope is the thing, that hope has really soured. And in a way, so the newer poems now are going back to the lyric and going back to the idea of love, because it's like the basic denominator of that. I have to come back to that, because without that we have nothing. And so I do have poems. Of course, I have poems about Gaza, I have poems about Ukraine, but a lot of them are more to do with the space of intimacy, of the connection between the sort of the individual I, and not always the we. And I think a lot of poems in this one are with the we, because there was this sense of, what are we going to do? And suddenly, so I think the answer is that there is no one approach to poetry, and each book, each set of poems you're working on, you have to find that approach. Sometimes it's more research driven, sometimes it's more personally driven, and I think maybe over time you get to trust the intuition and follow it, and say that this is how these poems need to be written. And then maybe the next set of poems, it's a different set of rules, and that's okay. You're allowed to do different things as a poet. It's not the one formula, and that goes for fiction too. Every book you have to figure out, how do I write this?
That's very interesting. Uh, so coming to the next question, you've described art as parasitic and how you get nutrients from others. So who are some of the people whose work you have read to nourish your mind that you love reading?
Everyone I read, every film I see, every artist I've seen, does affect you some way or the other, either in a moving towards, as in to say, how did they do that? And I want to be able to do the same thing, or a moving away from, like, that's not my aesthetic, or that's not what appeals to me. And it again changes. And there are, I think, like these, I have like an altar of these patron saints of art, some who travel with me since my 20s, some who have fallen off along the way. I think, it's always changing. There are writers who don't want to read while they're writing because they don't want to be influenced by another voice. And I've never been one of those writers. I am greedy for other voices. And I think that it's impossible to be in a germ free, bacteria free, like just your own little bunker with your own thoughts, because you in your own body are carrying all the ideas and so many things in your subconscious that you have tucked away, and those come through. Because writing is also about the mystery of life. It's a mysterious process. Why do we write? Where do the ideas come from? We think it might come from there, but we think it might start from there, but maybe you've been carrying it for 10 years, and then you see an image and out comes something. So I feel that I'm really interested in all those things, and I'm greedy. So I just take from wherever I take across the board. I would say, like, from Chekhov to Kamala Das to Rilke, Shakespeare to Sappho to Ramanujan to Kislowski to whoever. I mean, like whatever I'm reading or seeing, I will take. And I think there is a kind of filtration process that happens inside you, and something is left, but from that you create your own. It goes into your own voice. So I don't think like it's not a question of mimicking. It's not a question of saying, oh wow, Hemingway really had this snappy dialogue that he used in short stories. And even if you try it, or 10 of us try it, we will all have different attempts at doing this. So it's not about mimicking somebody, but it's about recognizing a style or a voice or an aesthetic or something that you can use. So everything is very usable, and that's why I say parasitic, because I think we are taking it whether or not we acknowledge it. We have these influences, and that's the joy also, because in a way we are allowed to be part of this very wide net of time. So life and death is meaningless in art. Like, you can have these conversations with writers who have gone many, many centuries before you, but if something in their voice speaks to you, you are able to connect with them, and then you make something and you are putting your voice into. So it's this giant web of time and voice. And I think it's a real exciting notion to be able to jump into that, with your own voice. Because if you thought, what do I have to say? Everything has already been said. There's nobody's waiting for another book, another novel, another poetry. Like it's all been done. So why do we write? We write because we have a compulsion to. We feel that our voice is something. So there's a bit of you can call it an ego, you can call it a self-centeredness, you can call it belief, whatever you want. But there's some compulsion for us to add our voice to this tapestry. And when we recognize it and we go toward it, embrace it, because, yeah, for a long time as a writer, nobody is giving you much encouragement. They're not saying, oh, yes, wonderful that you're writing a book. People are like, oh, great, another book of poems. That's just what we need. So I think you have to have belief in your own work. And I think that you get a lot of encouragement. I do, from the writers who I read, from whichever time zone they happen to be from.
So you've written about how a poem can be a place where riddles don't have answers. So which literary form do you prefer and why?
I think, I began as a poet. So poetry is the fundamental building block of how I navigate language. It is what I return to again and again. It is, I mean, right now, for instance, I can share with you all, I'm having a crisis in fiction. I'm unable to read fiction. I'm unable to get joy from fiction in a way that I used to. I still read, but it's a kind of forcing myself to read. So I'm jokingly calling myself nonfiction uncle, like, that uncle who never reads fiction and only reads like nonfiction. And I thought, oh dear, I've become that. I've become that I was so dismissive of that type of person who was dismissive of, I suppose, the imaginative qualities and powers of fiction, which I think I still believe are truly world altering. But I am having a moment where I find essays speak to me more, poetry speaks to me more. So I'm having a fiction slump. However, I think in terms of genres, poetry would be the sort of central place. But there's no, writing is writing. Whatever you're writing is the most important thing. So if it's a novel, that's the thing. If it's essays, that's the thing. So I think I don't take a hierarchical approach to, the dominant mode, but I would just say that for my own self, in terms of what I return to, it's poetry, and it's often the way that I kind of, it's also maybe my happiest, because writing a novel is really a lot of it's many months of your life which are kind of a little bit struggle. Like the joy in a poem is that once it's done, you put it aside and it's finished, and then the poems come together in a book. But with a novel, the sustained narrative can be quite hard going. So it's got great moments, but I think that poetry again feels more fluid and um, yeah, more where I feel my most comfortable.
So you kind of answered the second question, but still, I'll include both together. So, what is your approach to writing a novel? Is it completely different? Clearly, it is novel writing and poetry. But what is your approach? Do they feed into each other sometimes? And your characters in your novel are extremely vivid. And there's a lyricism to your novel writing as well. Uh, and what are the crucial elements that you keep in mind while building your characters?
So
So,
for many years, I worked as a journalist, and I interviewed so many writers about the art of writing, a lot of novelists, and I always asked them about their process because for me it was it is so fascinating. Like, where does it, how do you begin this mammoth task of creating your own universe, which is what a novel is, you know? And then I deduced that there are two types of writers. So I interviewed John Irving, and he told me that he always knows what the last sentence of his book is going to be. And he says, I don't know where I'm going to begin, but I know that last sentence, and I'm moving towards that last sentence like a beacon. And then I interviewed Michael Undache, and I said, you know, where does it begin? And he said, well, it begins with an image, a dream, a woman standing at a street corner. Why is she there? What is she looking at? And then the whole novel comes out of basically one image. And he said it's a lot of figuring it out as you go. And and then I thought, oh, you know, I wish I were the John Irving type of writer, but I am the Michael Ondaatje type of writer. And I think it's partly to do with being a poet and having that small scale, which is a more like the image is what we hold, and then from there you're building and building and you're figuring it out. So I think all novelists, whether David Mitchell, who has moleskin notebooks where he divides each part and he knows each thing, you have to find your own way. And like I said, every book will demand a different format, but I think we also, as people, we have our own systems of how we bring things out of us. And for me, really, the most basic simple thing I could say, and the advice that I give my students, is to just get on with it. And this is what I was also told by other novelists when I went on and on about my book. And they just get on with it, just write it. Through writing that first draft, then you figure out what kind of a book you're going to get. But if you over intellectualize it, if you overthink it, if you're paralyzed with fear that you can't write a single line because it has to be perfect, and you keep going back and going back, you'll get stuck and you will kind of stagnate. And so I think, like, for me, if I'm trying to write a book, the idea is to allow myself a certain fluidity, to make mistakes, to just write. There's also this thing of the throat clearing. In graduate school, I had a professor, and he would look at a poem that I'd written, and he'd just say, all this is throat clearing. Your poem starts here. And it's like on the third, stanza or something. And it's like first two stanza, I'm like getting ready. This is my poem is about. And he's like, this is where the poem starts. And so I think, like, a lot of throat clearing needs to happen before you get to what you think you want to say, or recognizing it, because we don't know. We don't have no matter what, you have all kinds of outlines and PowerPoint presentation and any kind of organizational method to character plot, whatever the thing is that you care about in fiction. There's still going to be, when you write, this mysterious process of suddenly following this other thing and just going with it and saying, oh, why am I going here? I thought I was writing about this. Turns out I'm writing about that. And you have to be, flexible to go, because I think that's where the mystery is. That's why we write. If we knew why we were writing it, then then why would we need to write it? So I think a lot of it is about just being disciplined, having stamina. And you need more stamina to write a novel. But just saying, all right, if I'm going to write, that means I need to spend a few hours. So some people have number of words that they write in a day, or 2 hours I'm going to sit, or whatever. Find your system and make yourself do it. And I think that's when something happens. And then from that, you go into the delicious state of editing, which is, I think, probably my favorite part of writing, is not so much the raw material, but going back and bringing out the gold.